this is a Pandora's box that has been opened. We don't know exactly where it will go, but we can say a few things with certainty. One is that the Russians will not abandon Iran. That's an absolute certainty. So they will stand with the Iranians. The Turks are not going to help to destroy Iran. That's a bridge too far for them. That's a war they don't want to have to fight. But the Turks could turn very easily against the Israelis. So that's real.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got the great privilege of talking to two fantastic US geopolitical analysts. One is James Carden, a journalist who once was an advisor to the US-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission under President Obama, and the other is the prolific Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. I'm sure most of you know him from other shows like the wonderful Judge Napolitano, where he regularly gives very valuable updates on the political impact of military developments in Europe and West Asia. James, Colonel, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too wrote recently a quite important piece in the American Conservative, which I will link in the description. Iran, America's next war of choice. Where you're kind of laying out the dangers of what might come now after the neocons are more or less done or have achieved in Syria something that they've tried for 14 years, which is a regime change. And I believe this deserves in-depth discussion. So may I ask you to, and maybe we start with Colonel Macgregor, why do you think Iran will be this America's next war of choice?
I think we have to realize that this has been the dream of many people in Washington for at least 30 years. Some people would go all the way back to 1980 and have regretted that we did not somehow or another punish Iran for having seized our embassy. And then over the years, we have tended to embrace the Israeli line, which is that everything that is wrong everywhere all the time in the region is ultimately Iran's fault. And therefore, whatever we can do to destroy Iran is in the long-term strategic interests of Israel. And they like to identify that with our own strategic interests. I don't agree with that. I don't see it that way at all. James?
Sure. This has been a very long-standing project, as you say, of Israel and its most dedicated partisans on Capitol Hill. Whenever someone says the word Iran on Capitol Hill, it almost seemingly by law requires the speaker then to say, is the world's leading state sponsor of terror. So there's been a decades-long propaganda effort laying the groundwork for regime change in Iran. And, you can see this, in successive administrations, even after Pompeo and Trump in the first Trump term pulled the plug on the really reckless programs authorized by Obama, by the CIA and the Pentagon to arm the Islamist rebels to overthrow Assad. The work continued, and we saw what I view as the tragic culmination of that work a few weeks ago when Assad fled the country in the face of the Islamist uprising.
On the one hand, there is there is the fact that Iran is now and has for a long time been the largest and strongest military opponent of Israel. And that, of course, the United States is famous for basically having linked its foreign policy to that of Israel, or completely married the two. I mean, I cannot think of another example in international relations where two states are that closely connected with each other, joined at the hip, as John Mearsheimer often says. But on the other hand, there's also a long-standing U.S. Rivalry with Iran, and Iran was one of the first CIA regime change operation back in the 1950s. Colonel, can you explain to yourself why it is that for like the last 70, 80 years, ever since the end of the Second World War, basically, the US seems to have constantly tried to meddle in Iranian affairs and did so successfully in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think we have to understand that at the beginning of the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency presented itself as an instrument with which we could alter international relations in our favor. They became heavily involved in Greece and in Italy. They actually dramatically influenced elections in Greece and in Italy. In Italy, in particular, one could go back and look at the facts and argue that the communists actually won the election in Italy. But we were certainly not going to allow the communists to win at the ballot box what they had not won on the battlefield. We accepted the fact, thanks to Churchill, that much of Eastern Europe would be consigned to the Soviets, but we weren't prepared to do that in either Greece or Italy. One of the reasons that Turkey is in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is in large part as a bulwark against communism, against Russian communism. So I think that's kind of a holdover. We have a permanent what would we call it, hangover from the Cold War, and we continue to look at the rest of the world even after 1991, 92, 93 through the same kind of lens. And so we've seen our government hijacked by a small number of people. They refer to themselves as neocons. Some people call them globalists. I'm sure there's some mix of the two that are determined that we are going to retain a monopoly of power, certainly in the West, certainly in Europe and the Middle East. There was always this obsession with the oil and controlling it because we saw ourselves as then potentially controlling what happened in Northeast Asia. You'll recall that one of the reasons the Japanese ultimately went to war when they did with us was because we embargoed the importation of oil to Japan in July of 1941. And at that point, everyone in Washington knew we were on the path to war with Japan. But that's what FDR wanted, and so ultimately that's what happened. We're still in a similar mindset today, thinking that if somehow or another we can gain control of the oil fields, that then we hold everybody in Northeast Asia hostage to it, especially China. I think that's infantile thinking at the moment, but I think that's still prevalent. That happens to coincide with this obsession with Israel, making Israel our unsinkable aircraft carrier that can sail all over the region and set fires. And I think that's what we are doing right now. We're essentially arsonists, along with the Israelis, essentially setting fire to the status quo. And of course, the most recent fire to break out is Syria. I think it's going to have hugely negative consequences for Israel. But at the moment, the Israelis and their friends in Washington are all celebrating the demise of Mr. Assad.
I mean, they were also celebrating the moment when Iraq was taken and Saddam Hussein was imprisoned and then ultimately hung and Mr. Gaddafi and James. Do you think that both of these, Iraq and Libya, in the end, they were thrown into chaos, and it didn't really improve the situation of Israel. It only created new alliances of enemies against Israel. And seeing that now in Syria you've the takeover of Islamists, just have a hard time believing that this is better than the Assad regime for Israel. How do you see that?
I think in the long term, it will be a disaster. I think in the short term, I think people really would be surprised to realize that the Israelis have been in bed with these people. They've been supporting, like we have, these Islamist terrorists because they, like us, are obsessed with Iran. So destroying the Syrian state, which is happening as we speak, has basically cleared a path for them without any resistance, any sort of military resistance, for their Air Force to fly right over Syria to open up the airspace to attack Iran. I do want to go back a second, though, to your question about the kind of roots of the American obsession with Iran. Of course, 1954, I believe it was, a very important marker in that. But I think that we should not nor the role that President Carter and his neoconservative Polish-born national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski played in the problem that we have now. And it was their insistence against the advice of very capable people like Undersecretary of State George Ball, who supported and then brought into the country the Shah of Iran. And that doing so was an enormously damaging thing, because it really, really upset the Islamists who were taking over Iran at the time. And it set our two countries on this kind of collision course that we're on now. The response to, bringing the Shah in for medical treatment, of course, resulted in the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, the taking of the 66 hostages, and then, of course, that set into motion the, again, disastrous decision at the urging of Brzezinski to launch this rescue operation that went so tragically wrong. So, yeah, we have a long history of antagonism with Iran, but it need not have been that way, but for neoconservative ideologues getting their hands on the levers of power. And so some things, unfortunately, never change.
Iran is one of these countries that has a long experience with with Western interventionism. It is often forgotten that in 1940 or 41, the father of the Shah was overthrown by the British and the Soviets when Iran tried to stay neutral, right? And we continue, this policy of Western interventionism continues, but now we're at the point where now that the Syrian air defenses are destroyed, in a lot of Western news media, we read that now the pathway for attacking Iran is open on, like, the Israeli missiles can now hit Tehran. Colonel, if I look at a map, I see that between Syria and Iraq, there still is a huge chunk of Iran, or parts of Turkey, or depending on how you want to shoot at it, even also Jordan. Can you explain to me why it is that people are saying that Syria was the linchpin that was so important in the defenses of Iran?
I think it has to do with one of the things that you mentioned, the overflight ability now. There's nothing to interfere with the flight of a strike package that aims at destroying missile sites or nuclear development sites or anything else in Iran through Syria. We and the Israelis have overflown Jordan and Saudi Arabia at will anyway. This just adds more airspace. It's also a route to Azerbaijan. And the Azeri government there, even though they're Turks like Mr. Erdogan, they're very supportive of Israel because the Israelis supported them against the Armenians. And so that's another platform from which to launch attacks against Iran. In other words, the Iranians are doing, or the Israelis are doing everything in their power to encircle Iran. There's a problem, though, with the larger picture. And that takes you back to what has actually happened on the ground. It's not just a question of the United States, although we've obviously paid for most of the insurgents and their equipment and training. It's also Turkey that's had a major hand in this, as well as the Mossad and MI6. I wouldn't exclude them. Wherever you see us operate, inevitably MI6 is in the neighborhood. The problem with all of this is that Mr. Erdogan is very much like Joseph Stalin. He's not going to announce a new jihad against Israel, but he's someone who is sitting on the fence waiting for the opportunity to swoop in and benefit from the dismantlement or disassembly of Syria. And so that's what he's done. The foreign minister of Iran, excuse me, wrong. It was the chief intelligence officer from Iran, flew into Damascus a few days ago. And he did something very symbolic if you're a Muslim, especially if you're a Turk, but a Muslim in general, Sunni Muslim. He immediately landed and went to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and prayed. And from there, he went off to interact with the HTS leader, Jalani, and others. The reason that's significant is that that's the second caliphate after Muhammad. You have the Umayyads who ruled for almost 100 years between roughly 950 to 840 to 950, somewhere in that neighborhood. And Damascus then became a capital of Islam, certainly under the Seljuk Turks and subsequently during the Ottoman Empire. So this is a return, if you will, of the empire. Now, it's also been mentioned that the foreign minister is going to visit. He may have already gotten there, I don't know. But inevitably, Mr. Erdogan will visit Damascus. And you can bet that his first stop-off point will be the Umayyad Mosque. Now, what does he want from Syria? Well, it gives him an opportunity to annihilate the Kurds. And remember, the Kurds are backed by us, funded by us, trained and equipped by us, along with the Israelis. Now, are we or the Israelis going to side suddenly with the Kurds against the Turkish armed forces when they finally move against the Kurds? Well, I leave that for your audience. You can run a poll and take votes and see who believes what will happen. I don't think we will. The Turks are going to finish off the Kurds. Then the question is what happens next? Because I would argue that if you look at this border, which runs just a little south of Damascus right now, all the way across Syria, in other words, this thing the Israelis call a security zone, as well as the areas they're currently colonizing over near the mountains on the western side, I think what we're going to see happen is that will effectively become the border of Turkey and Israel. So the Israelis are now facing the unhappy prospect of a border with Turkey, with very little in between them and the Turks. The question is, where do we come down on all of this? Remember, everything the Israelis do and have done thus far is based on our unconditional support, our unwavering readiness, no matter what they do, no matter how many millions of people they expel or murder or destroy, our support for that. The question is, how much longer will that support be there? Can they bet on it? So if I were an Israeli right now, I would look upon this whole thing with a great deal of trepidation. And I think the senior officers in the Israeli Defense Force view it in those terms because their army isn't very large. It's taken a beating, contrary to popular belief, at the hands of Hezbollah and Hamas. It's overstretched. The possibility they may need that to fight anywhere else is frightening. And they are largely reliant on their Air Force to do the jobs for them. Now they're going to face an enemy who has real air defenses, integrated air defenses in Iran. So what we were trying to do is say, if you're sitting where Mr. Netanyahu is now, you have to make some hard decisions. Do you pull back and try to consolidate what you have and risk this Turkish power in Syria metastasizing into something much larger and more problematic? Or do you say, while the Turks are busy with the Kurds, we go after Iran while we've got the United States to support us? We largely agreed that it's probably the second option. Because if they're going to go after Iran, they'd better go soon before the next election. Now, why would that be? Well, that's because we don't really know what Mr. Trump will do. I know everyone says, oh, well, he's hard and fast for the Israelis. But having worked with him and seen him in action, he's mercurial. And he may decide, well, I really don't want to support that. And I really want a deal. You often hear him say that. Mr. Netanyahu doesn't want any deals. He wants destruction of the Iranian leadership.
We'll talk about the destruction in just a second. But James, there are two precedents to me of the first Trump administration that I have a hard time consolidating, but maybe you two can. One is that Mr. Trump is the one who exited the JCPOA, the agreement which everybody, including the atomic watchdog, said no, the Iranians were fine with it. I mean, they did not try to exceed the limits of enriched of heavy water of enrichment, right, of their plutonium or uranium, whatever they used in order to create a bomb. He exited that, and that was to me quite damaging to the entire stability of like keeping a lid on Iranian nuclear weapons production. But the other one was this tanker moment, and I think it was in 2019 when there was a huge conflagration in the Straits, and there was a moment when a U.S. drone, I think, was shot down by the Iranians, and there was almost a war. I mean, the US almost attacked the place from where this drone was shot down, but then President Trump said no. And apparently, according to sources, Trump said no because it would have included Iranian casualties. And Trump said, like, this is disproportionate. We're not going to do that. And after that, the episode subsided and a war was averted. Maybe first James and then Colonel. What do you think this tells us about how Mr. Trump approaches Iran?
I think it might speak more to generally towards, and Doug can correct me if I'm wrong, towards Trump's kind of approach towards foreign affairs generally. In other words, he doesn't have any problem ripping up agreements, especially agreements that don't have his name on it. But he does seem to have an aversion to producing casualties, American or otherwise. So while I don't think that he necessarily thought through, he probably got bad advice with regard to tearing up the Iranian nuclear accord. I mean, let's be fair about it. Biden just completed 4 years, or whoever was in office for 4 years under Biden-Harris, and they jumped up and down and criticized Trump when he tore up the agreement. They had 4 years to put the agreement back together, and they didn't. They didn't do so. So that was an extremely damaging move, as you suggest. So.
Well, I think that both President Trump and President Biden are hostage to the Israeli lobby. We have to be frank with that. The Israel lobby controls enormous votes on the Hill, one way or the other, and regarding anything that's important to them. And I think that James is onto something, that President Trump decided, well, what difference does it make to me what happens with the GCPOA? I didn't negotiate that, and I can do that, and my friends in the Israel lobby will support me. He also launched missiles twice into the sand in Syria, where they did absolutely no damage, had no effect whatsoever. And we know that the response was to 2 false flags staged by MI6 with the white helmets in Syria. Well, he continues to act as though, see, I was tough and decisive. I launched those missiles. So I think there's also part of this, I want to be tough. I want to be a strong person. I want to be a strong guy. Which is kind of annoying because I don't think he has to prove that internationally or domestically. But nevertheless, I think that figures into this. But you're talking about the global hawk, and he was ambushed because that was arranged with General McKenzie, who diverted that particular global hawk, which was an ISR platform. It looks like a small B-52 that carries an intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and communications package. And he deliberately flew that right along the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, right through the Strait of Hormuz and then up through the middle of the Persian Gulf. Technically, in a court of international law, the Iranians had every right to shoot that down. They were never alerted to it. It was a military aircraft. They had the option of shooting it down, and they did. I don't think President Trump was aware that his national security advisor and the Joint Chiefs had done that was something that had occurred without his knowledge. If it occurred with his knowledge, I don't think he understood the ramifications, but when it was presented to him, one of his questions was, what happens after we launch this strike package to punish the Iranians? And then how many people will be killed? When it was clear to him that there would be a lot of people killed, then there was no plan for what do you do after you strike. He said, And I was nearby at that point in time, and I'd been on Tucker Carlson, and I had outlined it exactly in that fashion. He saw it, and others told him offline the same thing. But he had these vans and elaborate communication devices added to the White House. Everyone was expecting a war. The Air Force had their strike package ready to go with B-2s and so forth, and he pulled the plug on it. And there was enormous disappointment. Oh, gee, we almost had it. We had a war and we lost it. It's insane. And so now you've heard him also say on more than one occasion, I told Mr. Netanyahu I want him to get this war over with before I'm inaugurated. Well, good luck with that. But he says it, and I think he means it without necessarily understanding that this is already run out of control. It's gone beyond the so-called limits that we're accustomed to.
Can you expand on that? And also like the third episode that I forgot, which was signed off by Mr. Trump, which was the assassination of Mr. Soleimani, the head of the Iran's forces when he was in Baghdad, right? And also the fact that Iran constantly tries to de-escalate. I mean, after these kind of strikes, and we've seen that over the last year again and again with the attack on their consulate embassy in Syria, with the strikes of Israel, with the assassination of the one of the Hamas spokespeople or leaders in Tehran. The Iranians constantly strike back, but they strike back in a very clear fashion, saying like, "Stop this! We don't want to go to war with you.
Yes.
We could strike you, but we don't. We don't want to." Um, Maybe Colonel first, and then James.
No, you're right. That was an interesting development. And you have to remember that he did not make that decision in isolation. As I recollect, he had Lindsey Graham sitting with him in an office. I don't know if Senator Rubio was there. There may have been another senator there. I was called and asked about it when I was being considered for the nomination to go to Germany as the ambassador, and a U.S. senator asked me point blank. And I told him that I had gotten a phone call, not from President Trump, but someone on the staff asking me my opinion. I said, it's horrific. Don't do it. Mr. Soleimani, or General Soleimani, is a member of the Iranian government. Technically, under law, we're killing the member of a foreign government. There are laws against that. This is an assassination. It should not happen. You had all of these people in the military, either veterans or people that were still serving, that have this grudge against Iran because the Iranians provided a lot of expertise, technical support, and weaponry, particularly in the form of improvised explosive devices to the so-called insurgents in Iraq. And my answer to that was, well, what would we do if we saw foreign armies in Mexico and the Mexicans were fighting them? We would help the Mexicans. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. But the other point was that Soleimani had done yeoman service against ISIS and helped us to destroy much of this Islamist Sunni threat. So I was opposed to it, but I was told, no, this is something that is going to happen. And sure enough, he said, yeah, let's do it. And of course, the Israelis wanted that desperately. They saw Soleimani as the Antichrist and effectively wanted his death. And I think finally President Trump said, okay, let's kill him. And it's something we wouldn't normally do, Pascal, because he had spoken on an open line on a cell phone. Normally, he was very cautious and very careful, but he did, and that's what killed him. They knew exactly where he was, and along with the people next to him who were Iraqi and Iranian subordinates. So here we sit, and that sort of thing is dangerous, and that's why it is so important that the president surround himself with people who are not emotional and who actively support his intentions and not try to steer him in the wrong kind of direction. And that's another issue. James can talk about that one.
Yeah, we have Mr. Waltz, who probably will be the national security advisor, right? What do you think, James?
Well, not much, but I do want to. I don't think much about the incoming team, really. I do want to underline something that Doug has been talking about, and that is the influence of the Israel lobby on this policy towards Iran. And I would point out that even after, as I said before, Trump and Pompeo pulled the plug on these Obama-era programs, the pressure from the Israel lobby on Capitol Hill to wage economic war on Syria really intensified. And so we saw this in 2019 with the passage of the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, which basically were sectoral sanctions. But the aim was really to cripple the economy and to target everyday Syrians. And then, that was carried out by the lobby's most, passionate proponents. So you had, people like Congressman Elliot Engel, the disgraced senator from New Jersey, Robert Menendez, the outgoing senator from Maryland, Ben Cardin. But, the Caesar sanctions weren't enough. So 2 years later, the focus under Biden became the American opposition to Syrian reconstruction. And so, Anthony Blinken said this, very openly in October of 2021. He said, our position is to oppose the reconstruction of Syria. And sure enough, the House Foreign Affairs Committee passed the Assad Anti-Normalization Act, which doubled down on the Caesar sanctions. And so what you had really was a kind of covert economic warfare being waged on the Syrian state. And of course, it wasn't Assad himself in his palace who was suffering. It was ordinary people. And of course, that explains in large part why it was so easy for this Islamist group to march right through into Damascus only a few weeks ago.
Now, the only strategy that I can discern for like long-term strategy of Israel in order to achieve its goals of regional domination, of being the top dog, is to set fire to the rest around it, right? And keep everybody divided. And we see, for instance, how this works with the Kurds, right? That we have 24 million Kurds in that region, distributed over 5 countries. But the fact that they are divided, I mean, takes away a lot of their capacities. But the people remain, right? And in Iran, we do have a large part of the population who's actually not quite on board with their government, and who actually even say, why would we want to go and die for the Palestinians, right? Despite the fact that, or because of the fact that their government wants to support the Palestinians very strongly. But if you blow that up, all you do is you create new chances for reconfigurations. And Colonel, you already alluded to the fact that now we might have not a de jure, but a de facto border between Israel and Turkey, or at least their forces. Um, if Iran was actually attacked, and I believe both of you think that it is coming now because the forces are like all pushing in that one direction. Isn't it hugely dangerous to actually unleash forces in West Asia that neither Israel nor the United States could even imagine at the moment?
I'd say there's a damn good probability of that, yes. I mean, you have to understand that right now, the impact of Syria's disintegration and the expansion of these Islamist terrorists is being felt in Egypt. It's being felt in Jordan. People are wondering, will Jordan make it? Both the Jordanian king, who I think is a very decent and honorable man, as well as General Sisi in Cairo, are seen as Israeli American puppets by their population. So one wonders how much longer this can go on. Now, Sisi has recently given orders to prepare the army to fight. We're seeing some evidence for that. He's waiting, and he's going to watch carefully what the Turks do. And he's been to Turkey, as his members of his inner circle have, to negotiate and discuss these matters with Erdogan. I think this is a Pandora's box that has been opened. We don't know exactly where it will go, but we can say a few things with certainty. One is that the Russians will not abandon Iran. That's an absolute certainty. So they will stand with the Iranians. The Turks are not going to help to destroy Iran. That's a bridge too far for them. That's a war they don't want to have to fight. But the Turks could turn very easily against the Israelis. So that's real. And we tend to forget there are only two great powers in that region for most of the last 1,000 years. One is Turkey, and the other is Persia. It's either been a Turkish-ruled empire or it's been a Persian-ruled empire, and they fought with each other all through the 1700s and 1600s for dominance over all these places. We forget that the current border of eastern Iraq resulted in the 1840s from a negotiated end to a Persian-Turkish war. And it may be of interest to some people to know that the person who came in, negotiated that, and settled that war was the Tsar of Russia. In other words, these have all of these people have lived with each other for a long time. They all know each other. They understand their interests. The problem is, where do we fit in? What are our real vital strategic interests? What are the interests that determine whether or not we go to war? These questions are not being raised. There is no debate on the Hill. No one is asking these questions. There is no grand strategy. The strategy right now is give Israel whatever it wants and they'll be successful. That's all. There's no strategy to that. And there's no limitations on what the Israelis can or can't do. My point earlier was that that could conceivably change in some fashion after Trump becomes president. Because I've seen him in action, seen him do it before. He could do something like that again, which is why I think Netanyahu will decide to act.
James, can you explain to yourself the US obsession with West Asia, the Middle East? Again, like there's no threat to the US mainland emanating to that one, and settling Israel in a fashion that allows it to thrive in its neighborhood was tried in with Oslo 1993 and so on, with all down the drains, of course, but there would be so many approaches other than going to war.
Well, there's simply one explanation for it, is that American foreign policy in West Asia is run out of Tel Aviv. Sorry, but that's the case. But what we're about to see are probably two things. The first is, unfortunately, an attack at Netanyahu's assistance on Iran. And this is something that I think has to be done before Russia wraps up its operations in Ukraine, and before the inevitable bloodbath ensues in Syria. The other thing, and Doug alluded to this, is that there's a very high probability that we're going to witness a kind of Arab Spring Part 2 due to the refusal of these Arab leaders to do anything, to lift a finger to prevent the ethnic cleansing genocide that the Israelis have been carrying out against the Palestinians. So the unrest in the so-called Arab street is there and is dangerous. And what we're going to see, I think, is trouble from all sorts of directions in the Middle East. The other thing that, of course, American policymakers don't appreciate is the value of stability. So whatever the problems were on a human rights level with Assad, at the very least, he kept a lid on things. What I think we should expect to happen now is what happened in the wake of our very short-sighted, counterproductive overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya, and the first part of the Syrian regime operation that took place about 10, 12 years ago. And that is mass migration flows out of Syria into Turkey, into Europe. And what that presents is a very, very serious security challenge to our European partners and potentially us. And that's where we should be focusing our energies on. Not playing, the great game in West Asia. That isn't for us. But what we really need to be now focusing on, unfortunately, and once again, are the problems that we've caused for ourselves in terms of potential terrorist attacks in Europe and in America.
Yeah, and those are, of course, the view of people who would like to see the United States restrain its military capabilities abroad. But one more factor that I would like to discuss with you, gentlemen. When one war ends, we often see, or when one crisis ends, we often see a complete shift to another crisis. We've seen that with the end of the Corona crisis, which was basically ended with the war in Ukraine, because then suddenly the focus was there. Also, the humiliation of the US in Afghanistan, which then was immediately forgotten once you had like a half a year later the war breaking out. Less than half a year, only 5 months later, like in February, right, 2022 in Ukraine. And now it seems that the Ukraine war is winding down because only blind people can would not be able to read the signs what's going on there. But do you also think that this might add, in addition to the pressure to like open a new front, like also a mental front to focus on militarily for the United States? Or am I like overreading this a little bit, Colonel?
No, I don't think so. I think what you're pointing to is something else that we frequently mention, but we don't delve into it in depth, and that is that the Central Intelligence Agency is a force on its own. And there are certain habitual or routine behaviors which are now institutionalized. that have to do with this meddling, on the assumption that you can meddle and you can disable your potential adversary. You can win an advantage for us on the cheap. Something like the National Endowment for Democracy is really nothing more than a front for the same kind of activity. Wherever you have it, they're busy essentially pushing subversion and trying to undermine whatever the regime that is there in power. This kind of thing needs to stop. I think James is onto something when he talked about the great game. We've always had a certain amount of influence exerted on us by the British, to a lesser extent the French, who are age-old imperialists. And in fact, I was talking this weekend to someone who's British, and I said, "What is it for Britain that you're going to justify intervention in this part of the world? What's there to gain?" And he said, "Douglas, we're a frustrated imperial power, and so if we can join you in your meddling, then we feel as though we're still powerful and influential." I mean, that may be a simplistic answer, but I'm not sure it's inaccurate. Now, that's not a comment on the British people. I think the British people are totally disinterested, just as Americans are disinterested. I don't think Frenchmen are interested. I know the Germans aren't. So you're talking about a ruling elite class of neocons, globalists, and wannabe imperialists who are operating without accountability, largely because their parliamentary structures, certainly true in Great Britain, it's true for us in Washington, are in the pockets of people with a great deal of money who want to see these things happen. It's unfortunate. I did want to make one comment, though, that harkens back to something you asked earlier. It's back to how do these things happen? When Eisenhower was president, we had this unfortunate incident with the U-2. It was shot down over the Soviet Union. And 6 months, I think it's probably 5 months, 4.5 to 5 months earlier, Eisenhower had turned to the major general who was his military aide and assistant and said, "Tell the Air Force to shut that down. No more overflights. We don't need them. We're going to have satellites." They'd already understood that was going to make these overflights obsolete. It's too dangerous. Shut them down. He passed that on, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen because it was already scheduled. It was already routinized. They said, "Oh, well, it's time for another U-2 flight across the Soviet Union." And there was no note there that said the president said, "Don't do it anymore." Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. And that kind of thing is dangerous, and that can happen to any president. And I certainly think that's a danger that President Trump needs to confront early and figure out that the mistake was made because nobody went down to the Air Force and dug into the strike commands and the strategic bomber command, everything else, and say, "Wait a minute, has this stopped? Did you execute as ordered?" And the chief of staff is a busy man. He probably didn't get involved, didn't think very much one way or the other. This is the problem. We're big. We're huge. The bureaucracy is enormous. And things sort of take a life on their own, and they go on and on and on till somebody comes and says, either we're going to go to war or it needs to stop. And that's my great fear right now. There's too much that's triggered to happen without specific orders.
This
I
is
think
this
for
is
any
this is hugely
anything,
important. And James, in a second, like the US is not the US president, and Russia is not Vladimir Putin, and Iran is not just the Ayatollah. It's entire systems. Very, very important. And James.
yeah, I think, Doug's right. For anything to change, Donald Trump is going to have to do two things that no American president has done so far. And as Doug says, he's quite a individual, mercurial character. So who knows, he might do it. But the first thing is that he has to take on the foreign lobbies in Washington. The foreign lobbies have far too much influence on the formulation and conduct of American foreign policy. And I'm not just talking about the Israel lobby. There's what I call a captive nations lobby, which is a kind of relic of the Cold War that is really calling the shots with regard to American policy in Ukraine. The other thing that he has to take on, and it seems like there is some appetite to do this, is the bureaucracy, is the permanent state. And really, the lesson that Trump needs to learn, and he probably would not want to hear this, but he needs to do something that, he might like this, that Obama failed to do. And what Obama failed to do was really to staff down, was to go deep into the bureaucracy and weed out the people who were going to oppose his initiatives. And that's what he needs to do. They need to get in there and they need to stop appointing these neoconservatives who are not going to carry out his America First agenda. And right now, there's a lot of debate going on about who he's going to appoint to be the State Department's chief, Middle East expert. On the one hand, there's, this neocon who comes from the tradition of Bush Cheney. And, there's some new blood, but there's a real battle going on, I think, behind the scenes with regard to America First versus old school neoconservatism. So we'll have to wait and see. But he really needs to take on foreign influence in Washington and the neocons who are buried very deep in the national security bureaucracy.
Colonel, the last word goes to you. If President-elect Donald Trump was listening to this podcast, what should he do in order to undo this hugeness of the United States that you just laid out, and to prevent a U2 moment of like lower levels not obeying what he does, like in the sense that James did? Or should he just announce cardinal policies and say, like, nobody must act against policy X, like we are not going to war with Iran, or things like that? What would you advise?
I think it would be useful for him to make it clear, either informally or through specific channels, that we are not interested in going to war with Iran. I think that should be made very, very clear. And he should guard against the possibility that he's ambushed after 20 January into something. Now, there's no one, as far as I can tell, in the White House who's going to say that right now. They may say it privately, but they're not really in control. That's the problem. I don't think they've ever been completely in control. I think they're wealthy oligarchs behind the scenes, working closely with the Israelis to make things happen. And they have appointed people to take jobs inside the Department of Defense and the State Department elsewhere who will execute that will. So the first thing he can do right now is send that message. But I would argue that one of the even more important, frankly, is to put an end to the war in Ukraine. And everything that I've heard thus far indicates that that's not going to happen. He's now said that he's going to continue aid. Well, the quickest way to stop this war is to suspend the aid. Someone needs to sit down with the president and point out that 50% of everything we've sent in terms of cash and equipment has ended up being squandered through criminality, black market, payoffs, and so forth. So why would you want to do that? And as soon as you say you're not going to send any more military aid, war's going to be over. Then it'll look like our friends in Afghanistan, packing their cars and planes with bags of cash and fleeing the country, because at that point they're through. They've had it. We need to come to terms with that reality. And the other thing I think is that he should say, I want all American personnel, military or otherwise, in or out of uniform, out of Ukraine by a certain date, preferably as soon as possible. Now, what does that do? It makes it clear we've had it. And the ball will then be in the European court. It's then going to be up to the Germans, the Poles, the French, and Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Romanians, Slovaks, Hungarians. Boys, we're out. That means the so-called NATO members, they're going to fold. Without us, it's over. All right, fine, it's over. You now, and you should tell them, I'm happy to host the conference. I'll back you up. Sit down and work this out with Moscow. But it gets us out of it. And that's something that he has said he wants. He doesn't want us to be the first responder. He has said that repeatedly. He has said NATO must become European. Lots of Europeans feel that way too. Well, let's let it happen. I think that's very important. If he does that, he may find that Russia is a more amenable partner strategically in the Middle East. But right now, he's got an opponent in Moscow, and there's no good news on the horizon in the Middle East. Everything is falling apart over there. The Russians are sick of it. They're not going to support it because they see us as arsonists. That's who we are. So you're looking for a strategy. It's a strategy for arson. That's it.
Gentlemen, and everybody listening, I advise the only thing that should be lit at this time is the candles on Christmas trees and not West Asia. James Carden and Colonel Macgregor, thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, thank you. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Alan.
God bless us one and all.